James had always dreamed of living in a peaceful, secluded home where the noise of the city couldn't follow. When he found the perfect property, a charming house tucked away at the edge of a small, gated community, it seemed like a dream come true. The property came with a generous stretch of land, including a narrow path that connected to one of the HOA-maintained roads in the neighborhood. It wasn't paved, but it was clear enough to look like a road, though James paid it little mind when he moved in. After all, it was part of his property and he assumed everyone in the neighborhood respected those boundaries. For the first few weeks, James enjoyed the quiet mornings and serene sunsets. The occasional sound of a passing car was just background noise. But then he started noticing patterns, cars driving through the strip of land more frequently, especially during peak hours. At first it didn't bother him. Maybe it was a shortcut the previous owner had allowed, or maybe it was just an honest misunderstanding by a few neighbors. Soon, however, the situation escalated. It wasn't just a couple of cars anymore. It was a parade of vehicles every morning and evening. James often found himself standing on his porch, watching as drivers casually cut through his property. Some waved cheerfully as if to thank him for the convenience, while others sped by without so much as a glance, tires kicking up dirt and gravel. One particularly bold driver even rolled down their window and yelled, "Keep it clear." It's a great shortcut. James decided to let it go for a while, hoping it would taper off, but that hope was short-lived. One morning he came outside to find deep tire ruts carved into his yard after a car had spun out, tearing up the grass and leaving behind a mess. That was the last straw. His dream of a peaceful home was quickly becoming a nightmare. Something had to change. He contacted the HOA assuming they would help. After all, the community had rules and this blatant disregard for his property surely violated them. But when he called, the response was anything but helpful. "That strip of land isn't within our jurisdiction," the representative said dismissively. "We can't do anything about it." Frustrated but determined, James realized he'd have to solve the problem himself. He wasn't one to back down and this was his land. Little did he know his decision to take control of the situation would set off a chain of events that would test his resolve, his patience, and his understanding of just how entitled people could be. For a few days after the incident with the torn-up yard, James avoided the strip of land altogether. It was too frustrating to look at the damage, and every time he thought about the cars, it reminded him how his property was being treated like a public road. But the problem didn't disappear just because he tried to ignore it. If anything, it got worse. Cars continued to cut through his land, and the frequency only seemed to increase. Morning commutes, afternoon errands, evening shortcuts. His strip of land had become a free-for-all. One evening, James stood on his porch and waved at a car as it sped through. Instead of slowing down, the driver gave him an exaggerated shrug as if to say, "What's the big deal?" It wasn't just frustrating. It felt like an invasion of his privacy. These people weren't just trespassing, they were acting like they had every right to be there. It was the next morning, though, that really pushed James over the edge. As he stepped out to check the mail, he noticed a car turning onto the strip. The driver took the turn too sharply and the tires spun out in the gravel, sending chunks of dirt flying. The vehicle wobbled for a moment before straightening out and speeding away, leaving behind yet another set of deep ruts in the ground. James stood frozen, his fists clenched, staring at the fresh scars on his property. That night he stayed up late researching his options. From HOA guidelines to local property laws, he dove into anything that might give him leverage. By the time he went to bed, he had a plan. If the HOA wouldn't act, he would. The next day, James called a contractor to install a fence along the strip. He envisioned something sturdy and secure, something that would make it clear his land was off limits. Within a week, the fence was up, complete with a large gate at the entrance. James also placed no trespassing signs along the stretch, leaving no room for excuses. He felt a wave of relief when the work was done. For the first time in weeks, his property felt like his own again. The peace didn't last long. A few days later, James heard a loud, insistent honking outside. When he stepped onto his porch, he saw a sleek black SUV idling in front of the gate. The driver, a woman in her 50s with a sharp haircut and an air of authority, stepped out and immediately began walking toward him. Even before she spoke, James could sense her annoyance. "Are you the one who put up this gate?" she demanded, her voice dripping with indignation. James nodded, unsure where this was going. "It's my property," he replied calmly. I put it up to stop people from trespassing. Well, you need to take it down now, she snapped. This road has been used for years and you don't have the right to block it. James was taken aback by her boldness. I'm sorry, he said, trying to remain polite, but this isn't a public road. It's part of my property. I don't want people driving through it anymore. Her face turned red and her voice rose a notch. I'm on the HOA board, she said, as if that alone should settle the matter. This access point is important to the community. You can't just block it because you feel like it. We've been using this for years and you don't have the right to stop us. James stood his ground, though his heart raced. It's not an access point, he said firmly. It's private property. And the HOA has no jurisdiction here. The woman, who introduced herself as Karen, looked livid. You'll regret this, she hissed, pulling out her phone. I'm calling the police. James watched, half in disbelief, as she dialed and began speaking animatedly. He couldn't hear every word, but phrases like blocking public access and uncooperative floated over to him. Despite his frustration, James knew he had the upper hand. He had the paperwork to prove the strip was his, and he had made sure the fence was within legal boundaries. When the police arrived, James calmly explained the situation, showing them the property map and pointing out the signs and the gate. The officer listened carefully, examined the documents and nodded. It's clear this is private property, the officer said. You're within your rights to put up the gate. Karen, however, wasn't satisfied. She argued with the officer, her voice rising with every sentence. This is ridiculous. He's cutting off access for the entire neighborhood. The officer remained patient but firm. Ma'am, this isn't a public road. It's his property. He has every right to restrict access. Karen's face was a mask of fury as she stormed back to her car. This isn't over, she shouted before driving off. As James watched her leave, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He'd won the first round, but something told him this was just the beginning. People like Karen didn't back down easily, and James had a feeling she wasn't done with him yet. James had barely had time to enjoy the small victory with the police before the confrontation with Karen escalated. Less than 48 hours after the incident, a letter from the HOA appeared in his mailbox, signed by none other than Karen herself. It demanded that he remove the gate immediately, claiming it was obstructing a long-standing community access point. The tone of the letter was both condescending and threatening, filled with vague references to legal consequences if he didn't comply. James chuckled bitterly as he read the letter. He'd already confirmed with both the police and his lawyer that the HOA had no jurisdiction over his land, but the audacity of their demands only steeled his resolve. He decided to ignore the letter and let Karen stew in her frustration. However, Karen had no intention of letting the matter rest. The next day, James heard loud voices outside. Peering out his window, he saw Karen standing by the gate again, this time flanked by two other HOA board members, both wearing equally stern expressions. Karen was gesturing wildly, pointing at the gate as if she were rallying troops for battle. James sighed, grabbed his phone and stepped outside. Oh good. You're finally here, Karen said, her tone dripping with mock relief. We've been discussing the situation and we've decided you need to take this gate down immediately. You're disrupting the entire neighborhood. James raised an eyebrow. Decided? That's interesting considering this is my property. I don't recall inviting you to make decisions about it. One of the other board members, a man in his 60s named Bill, tried to interject, speaking in a calmer tone. Look, James, we understand your perspective, but this access point has been used by the community for years. It's about convenience for everyone. James nodded slowly, pretending to consider the argument. Convenience for everyone, except me, the actual property owner. I've already explained this to Karen. This isn't a public road and I have every right to block access. If people wanted a shortcut, they should have bought this land themselves. Karen's face darkened. That's enough, she snapped. You're being unreasonable. You think you can just come in here and ruin the way this community operates? You don't know who you're dealing with. The HOA will not let this slide. James smirked. I think I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Someone who's used to getting her way by bullying others. But I don't intimidate easily. Karen's eyes narrowed and for a moment, James thought she might lunge at him. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began filming. Let the record show, she announced dramatically, This man is deliberately obstructing a road that has been used by this community for decades. We'll see how smug you are when this is brought to court." James crossed his arms, unfazed. "Make sure to get my good side," he said dryly. "And while you're at it, feel free to include the no trespassing signs in your video. They make a great backdrop." Karen's frustration boiled over. "Fine," she snapped, turning off the camera. "If you won't listen to reason, I'll handle this the hard way." Before James could ask what she meant, Karen stormed off with her entourage, muttering about lawyers and higher authorities. He watched them go, his gut telling him that whatever Karen had planned next wasn't going to be pleasant. 2 nights later, James found out just how far Karen was willing to go. It was around midnight when his security system sent him an alert. Someone was on his property. Groggy but alarmed, he grabbed his phone to check the camera feed. What he saw made his blood boil. A group of men with construction equipment was dismantling his gate. They worked quickly and quietly, clearly trying to avoid attention. James recognized Karen's SUV parked nearby, her silhouette visible as she supervised the operation. James wasted no time. He called the police, explaining the situation in detail. By the time the officers arrived, the group had managed to remove part of the gate, but they hadn't gotten far enough to escape unnoticed. The police immediately intervened, questioning the workers and Karen, who tried to play innocent. "They're here on HOA business," Karen said indignantly. "We're simply restoring access to a road that should never have been blocked in the first place." The lead officer wasn't buying it. "Ma'am, this is private property. You don't have the authority to make changes here without the owner's permission." Karen's confidence faltered. "But it's for the community. You can't just cut us off like this." The officer turned to James, who had joined them outside. "Do you want to press charges?" he asked. James hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Absolutely. This isn't the first time she's tried to intimidate me. Maybe this will finally make it clear." Karen's face turned ashen as the officer informed her that she was being cited for trespassing and vandalism. The workers, realizing they'd been caught in the middle of a bad situation, quickly distanced themselves from Karen, claiming they had no idea the gate was on private property. As the police escorted Karen away, she glared at James over her shoulder. "You'll regret this," she spat. "You don't know who you're messing with." James watched her leave, his heart pounding but his resolve stronger than ever. He didn't know what Karen's next move would be, but he was ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just about a gate anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. In the days following Karen's midnight stunt, James worked tirelessly to repair the damage to his gate. The incident left him shaken but more determined than ever. Karen's brazenness had crossed a line, and James knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. Sure enough, a new letter arrived in his mailbox less than a week later, this time bearing the HOA's official letterhead and signed by its president, along with Karen's name prominently listed as vice president. The tone of the letter was cold and formal, accusing James of interfering with community access and threatening legal action if the gate wasn't removed immediately. James couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. The letter cited a supposed historical right of access that James had allegedly violated. It was a baseless claim and James knew it. He had already confirmed with his lawyer that no such easement or agreement existed, but the HOA seemed intent on bluffing their way into forcing him to comply. What struck James the most was how far Karen was willing to go to assert control. The letter included a proposed mediation session where James would be expected to meet with the HOA board to resolve the matter. The date and time had already been set, as if his attendance was mandatory. It was clear the HOA believed they were in a position of power, but James had no intention of bowing to their demands. Instead, he decided to take a proactive approach. He gathered every piece of evidence he had: the property deeds, surveys proving his ownership of the land, documentation from his lawyer, photos of the damage caused by trespassers, and the security footage of Karen overseeing the gate's destruction. He was prepared to counter every argument they could possibly make. On the day of the meeting, James walked into the HOA's office with his head held high. The room was packed with board members, many of whom he recognized as neighbors. Karen sat at the head of the table, her expression smug and confident. She was clearly enjoying the spectacle, as if she were about to deliver a public scolding to an unruly child. James, however, was ready for her. The meeting began with the HOA president giving a brief introduction, outlining the issues with James's gate. "This access point has been an essential part of our community for decades," he stated. "Your actions have disrupted the flow of traffic and caused significant inconvenience to our residents." Karen jumped in, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. "We've tried to handle this amicably, but Mr. Sanders has shown no regard for the community's needs. This gate is an act of hostility, plain and simple." James let them speak, waiting for the perfect moment to counter. When the floor was finally opened to him, he stood, calmly placed his stack of documents on the table and began. "With all due respect, everything you've just said is incorrect," James started. "First, let's address this so-called historical access point. This strip of land has never been a public road. It's private property and I have the legal documents to prove it." He slid copies of his deed and property survey across the table. Karen's smug expression faltered, but she quickly recovered. "That doesn't change the fact that it's been used by the community for years. That establishes a right of access." James smiled faintly. "Actually, it doesn't. I've consulted with my lawyer, and there's no easement or legal precedent granting the HOA or its residents any right to use my property. Past use doesn't override private ownership." He then pulled out the footage of the trespassing and the late-night destruction of his gate, placing a tablet on the table so everyone could see. The room went silent as the video played. The sight of Karen directing workers to tear down the gate left the other board members visibly uncomfortable. One of them, a man named Greg, finally broke the silence. "Karen, what is this? You didn't mention anything about this incident." Karen's face turned crimson. "It's not what it looks like," she stammered. "I was trying to resolve the situation for the good of the community." James didn't let up. "You mean by vandalizing my property in the middle of the night? That's not resolving anything, it's illegal. And if you're wondering, yes, I've already filed a report with the police. I'm well within my rights to press charges." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Some board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly realizing the situation was spiraling out of control. Karen tried to regain control, her voice rising in desperation. "This is ridiculous. You're making this about me when it's about the community. The HOA has the authority to enforce rules that benefit everyone." "Not on private property, you don't," James interrupted, his voice firm but measured. "The HOA's jurisdiction ends at your community boundaries. My property isn't part of your HOA, and you have no legal standing here. I'd suggest you consult your own lawyer before making any more threats." The HOA president, who had remained silent for most of the exchange, finally spoke up. "Karen, he's right. If this land isn't under HOA jurisdiction, we can't enforce anything. We need to tread carefully here." Karen looked like she was about to explode. "We can't just let him block the road. This is setting a dangerous precedent." Greg spoke again, his tone conciliatory. "Look, maybe it's time we take a step back and reevaluate. We're not doing ourselves any favors by escalating this." It was clear the board was beginning to see reason, but Karen wasn't ready to admit defeat. She stood abruptly, slamming her hands on the table. "This isn't over. You'll regret this, James. Mark my words." James didn't flinch. "Do what you need to, Karen. But I suggest you think carefully before crossing the line again. I'm prepared to defend my rights every step of the way." Karen stormed out, leaving the rest of the board in awkward silence. The president eventually adjourned the meeting, promising to review the legalities further before taking any action. James walked out feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He knew Karen wasn't done, but he also knew the tide was turning in his favor. The HOA's scheme was unraveling, and for the first time, James felt like victory was within reach. A few days after the heated HOA meeting, James received an unexpected call from his lawyer. Karen had officially filed a complaint against him, claiming the HOA had a legal right to enforce access to the strip of land based on an alleged community easement. James was unfazed. His lawyer assured him the claim was baseless, but the move signaled Karen's desperation. It also meant she was prepared to escalate the situation, dragging the HOA into a legal battle. James decided it was time to turn the tables. Up until now, he had been on the defensive, reacting to Karen's antics and the HOA's aggressive letters. But if Karen and the HOA wanted a fight, he would give them one, on his terms. The first step was public exposure. James reached out to a local news station known for covering disputes between residents and HOAs. He sent a detailed summary of his situation, complete with the legal documents, photos of his property, and the video footage of Karen supervising the gate's destruction. The news station was immediately interested. Within days they scheduled an interview with James. The crew arrived at James's home early one morning, setting up their equipment near the controversial strip of land. James walked them through the story, explaining how the HOA and Karen had overstepped their bounds. He showed them the freshly repaired gate, the no trespassing signs, and the property survey proving the land was privately owned. The reporters were particularly interested in the footage of Karen's midnight stunt, which they agreed to include in their segment. "This isn't just about me," James said during the interview. "This is about standing up to people who abuse their power. HOAs are supposed to serve their communities, not bully individual homeowners into giving up their rights." The interview aired later that evening and the response was overwhelming. James received dozens of messages from people in the area who had faced similar conflicts with the HOA. Some thanked him for standing up to the board, while others shared their own horror stories about Karen's overreach. The segment also sparked outrage on social media, with viewers condemning Karen's behavior and the HOA's tactics. Karen, of course, was livid. The morning after the broadcast, James saw her pacing outside the gate, her phone pressed to her ear. She didn't bother honking or yelling this time. She simply stood there, glaring at the camera mounted on the gate post. James couldn't hear her conversation, but he had a good guess it involved damage control. A few days later, Karen made her next move. James received yet another letter from the HOA, this time distancing themselves from her actions. The letter acknowledged that Karen had acted independently during the incident with the gate and emphasized that the HOA had no plans to take further action against him. It was a clear attempt to save face in light of the public backlash, but James wasn't convinced the ordeal was over. Then something unexpected happened. Karen showed up at his front door. James opened the door cautiously, half expecting another confrontation. But Karen's demeanor was different this time. She wasn't the overconfident, self-righteous figure he had dealt with before. Instead, she seemed almost apologetic. "James," she began, her voice uncharacteristically soft. I saw the news. And I've had some time to think." James raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting her continue. "I realize now that I may have overreacted," she admitted, looking down at the ground. "I was so focused on what I thought was best for the community that I didn't stop to consider that I was overstepping. The board agrees we don't have the authority to enforce anything on your property." James crossed his arms, still wary of her sudden change in tone. "And the midnight vandalism?" he asked. "Was that for the good of the community too?" Karen winced. "That was a mistake. I don't have an excuse for it, and I understand if you're still upset. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." James studied her for a moment, searching for any trace of insincerity. To his surprise, she seemed genuine. But he wasn't ready to let her off the hook completely. "Apologies are a good start," he said. "But you need to understand something. This isn't just about me. People like you, people who think their position gives them the right to intimidate others, you cause real harm. That's not how a community should operate." Karen nodded, looking chastened. "You're right. I've already stepped down from the board. It's clear I let my position go to my head." James blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected her to go that far. "You stepped down?" She nodded again. "After the news aired, a lot of residents voiced their concerns. It became clear that my actions reflected poorly on the entire HOA. Stepping down was the right thing to do." James felt a mix of relief and disbelief. Karen, the woman who had spent weeks making his life miserable, was finally backing down. "I appreciate you coming here to say this," he said cautiously. "But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that actions speak louder than words. I hope you take this as a lesson moving forward." "I will," Karen said. "And I'll leave you alone from now on. You have my word." With that, she turned and walked away. James watched her go, unsure whether to feel triumphant or simply drained. The battle had been exhausting, but it seemed like it was finally over. In the weeks that followed, James received an official apology from the HOA. The letter confirmed that they would no longer pursue any action regarding his property and issued a reminder to all residents to respect private boundaries. The gate remained intact, the trespassing stopped, and for the first time in months, James felt a sense of peace. Karen faded quietly from the community spotlight, and though James occasionally saw her at a distance, she never approached him again. The whole ordeal had been a long and painful lesson, but it left James with a renewed sense of confidence. He had stood his ground, and in the end he had won. In the weeks after Karen's apology, life around James's property returned to a semblance of normalcy. The gate remained firmly in place, and the once steady stream of trespassers disappeared entirely. The HOA, likely eager to avoid further public embarrassment, ceased all communication on the matter. James finally had the peace and quiet he had sought when he first moved in. One afternoon he received a formal letter from the HOA president. The tone of the letter was markedly different from the aggressive correspondence he'd grown used to. It included a formal apology, acknowledging that the HOA had overstepped its bounds and clarifying that they would no longer pursue any action against him. The letter also outlined new community guidelines emphasizing respect for private property, a clear attempt to save face after the negative attention they had received. James read the letter with mixed feelings. He appreciated the gesture, but it was clear the HOA's actions were motivated by public pressure rather than genuine remorse. Still, it was a victory, and he was glad the ordeal seemed to be over. He had learned a valuable lesson. Standing up for himself and knowing his rights were the key to dealing with bullies, even when they came in the form of HOA board members. The change in the neighborhood was palpable. Neighbors who had once used his strip of land as a shortcut now waved at him politely as they drove by on the main road. A few even stopped to apologize, admitting they hadn't realized the land was private. James appreciated the goodwill, though he remained cautious. It was hard to shake the memory of how easily things had spiraled out of control. Karen, for her part, kept her promise to leave him alone. She had quietly stepped down from the HOA board, and though James occasionally spotted her around the neighborhood, she avoided him. The Karen who had once stormed onto his property with threats and indignation seemed to have disappeared. Months later, James found a small envelope in his mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA or a neighbor but from Karen herself. The note inside was brief but sincere. James, I want to thank you for standing your ground and for helping me see how wrong I was. I've learned a lot from this experience and I'm truly sorry for everything. Sincerely, Karen. James folded the note and placed it in a drawer. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully forgive her, but he appreciated the effort. For the first time in what felt like forever, his property was his own, and his dream of living in peace had finally been realized. If you were in James's shoes, how would you have handled Karen and the HOA? Do you think he should have pressed charges, or was he right to accept Karen's apology and move on? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take on this wild story. What a wild ride, right? If you enjoyed hearing how James stood his ground against Karen and the HOA, make sure to smash that like button. And hey, if you've ever had your own run-ins with an over-the-top neighbor or HOA drama, hit subscribe and join our community. We've got plenty more stories like this coming your way. Don't miss out.